All right, welcome back everybody. If this is your first time to the channel, welcome to Notes to Fret, where we are all about turning theory into riffs. And this is our third video in the series for intervals. It's kind of a bonus where we talk about why some of the intervals are named, necessarily what they are. In this particular video, we're really kind of going over naming conventions. So if you haven't watched the other ones, this will still be very informative for you. So, no real prereqs for this one. Again, we are looking at intervals from a perspective of what does it mean and how is it useful to guitar players, bassists as well. So again, if you're here from another instrument, you'll certainly get a lot out of it, but I just wanted to put that out there that we're going to be looking at a lot at the fretboard. But anyways, with that being said, let's talk about some of the more kind of formal it's formal, but we're going to talk about it in a very informal way. Some of the intervals we just have to talk about from the names of major and minor, right? And that's pretty straightforward when we look at major and minor, how they relate to one another, right? And that's where we get some of the relative size, right? We talk about relative sizing, but it's a fret distance. Is it 1 fret, up 1 fret, back 1 fret, back 2 frets, 1 semitone, up to whatever, right? And we all know a semitone is 1 fret. So looking at this from a bit more, with a little bit more formality involved. A minor interval, meaning it's smaller or less than your major, right? It's reduced by 1 fret, right? Going up towards the headstock of your instrument. And, when we talk about the major interval, it's kind of the opposite, right? We go up 1 fret, kind of, coming down towards the body of our instrument, whether it's a bass or a guitar. So those are larger. When we talk about larger, right, the count of the frets becomes larger, right? The 12th fret is larger than the 1st fret, sort of thing. So we're not talking about fret size on the guitar fretboard, but the number 12 is right higher than 1. So anyways, the major interval, right? We're just getting larger as we go down, right? Meaning we move up the fretboard. Now, with that, we spoke in the previous video about augmented and diminished, and they kind of mean the same thing, right? It's going up the fretboard or down the fretboard, right? And so, yes, they do kind of mean the same thing, but as we talked about, a major being up 1 fret. What happens when we move a major up 1 fret, right? We don't do major. We start to talk about augmented, and perfects. We get the augmented fourth. Sort of thing. We don't get a major fourth. So it's another term for moving up the fret, right? One fret higher than it was previously. But it kind of refers to, you augment majors or you augment perfects. And from a you don't augment a minor, you move a minor to a major. So that's why we kind of have similar terms that, seemingly mean the same thing. But if you watch the previous video, you kind of understand where the augmented versus the major starts to come into use. And for anyone who hasn't seen the previous video, really it relates to how you're using the intervals in a scale. Will determine whether or not you start calling things major, augmented, or any number of other naming conventions we have. But as we talk about the augmented, we also have to talk about the diminished, which is moving back 1 fret. But again, what does it mean to move a minor back 1 fret? We don't say a minor. Moving a major back 1 fret, we go to our minor. But again, what does it mean to say move a minor back? Well, that's where we get diminished, right? So we have to have these other terms that seemingly mean very similar things, right? Moving back or up a fret. In this case, diminished, moving back. Perfects are normally diminished. We talked about we can't have diminished, diminished third as opposed, going from a minor third to a diminished third. But again, that has to do with how they relate to a scale. And if you haven't seen the previous videos on intervals, I encourage you to go watch those. to understand a little bit how we kind of determine whether or not we're going to use the term diminished or augmented or minor or major. But really, everything that we're talking about here is really the intervals movement. Again, the augmented and diminished, the minors and the majors, we move up, we move down, kind of seems to make sense, right? But there's one interval that has kind of a weird naming convention, right? We have this perfect interval, and why perfect? What does perfect really mean? As we're talking about intervals, this perfect term keeps coming up. The major, the minor makes sense. The diminished, the augmented, they make sense in the fact that we're moving up or back. But all of a sudden we have these perfects, and we don't even talk about moving up or back. Nothing there. It's just we have these perfect intervals. So what does it even mean? Well, a perfect interval is a tonal center with a given aspect ratio. And that statement in and of itself makes it sound even worse. That's even more confusing. That's horrible. The unfortunate part about it is it's actually an accurate statement. So what I want to do, because I acknowledge that's just sounds crazy, I want to step out of music just for a moment. We're really not, but we kind of are. Stepping out of music just to understand another concept that will relate back to music and will make the perfects make a lot more sense here in just a moment. So the first thing I want to do is I want to look at a square, a theoretically perfect square. And that means that we have, let's just say as an example, we have a square that's 1 inch by 1 inch, meaning that the width is 1 inch and the height is 1 inch. Now this could be 1 mile, 1 kilometer, it could be anything. And, I'm sure that there might be somebody out there, talking about the imperial and the metric, and, I'll address that in a second. But here, what's more important that I want to look at is the width and the height are equal. So no matter what, if we keep this square in this perfect 1 by 1, what we call that is an aspect ratio of 1 by 1. Meaning for every 1 unit across in the width, we have an equal 1 unit in height, right? And in this case, our unit is an inch. Again, it could be a mile, it could be a kilometer, it doesn't matter. It's a 1-to-1 aspect ratio. Now, just to kind of expand on this a little bit, let's take a rectangle that, in this case, is 2 by 1. Okay, so for every 2 units across, we get 1 unit of height. So if this was, 2 kilometers by 1 kilometer, it doesn't matter, whatever the unit is, we have a 2-to-1 aspect ratio. Okay, no matter what, we have a width of 2 and a height of 1. And you may be thinking to yourself, why are we looking at squares? Okay, I understand now what an aspect ratio means, but how does this square have anything whatsoever to do with music, let alone a perfect interval? So the one thing I want to point out here is we'll notice that the aspect ratios aren't 2.8 to 1.4, or they're not 2.3 to 1.6. They are exactly 2 to 1. In the previous diagram, we saw exactly 1 to 1, not 1.8 to 1.2. We saw 1 to 1, and here we see exactly 2 to 1. Some may call that a perfect ratio. It's not, but you get the idea. There's no decimal point, essentially. Okay, that's what I want you to take away from these aspect ratios that I'm showing you right now. Now let's take the height and the width that we're talking about from these squares and put it to music. When we think about music, we don't think about squares. We probably think about waves, right? And this is just FM, your typical FM radio, frequency modulation. And the way that frequency modulation works, if you don't know this, It just means that the distance between the peaks varies. And you can kind of see that in this picture. In the middle, there's a wide variation between the distance between the peaks. And if we look a little bit further to the left or the right, the peaks get much closer together. Now, and that's just the frequency of the wave. But the height and the depth, or the valleys, the peaks and the valleys, that's consistent. It's not an amplitude modulation. It's not a peak and valley difference. It's just the width between the wavelengths, right? And so we might think of this kind of seemingly more as music. And if we want to take a look at that, we could look at the distance between the peaks and call that our width. And then we can take the distance between the peaks and the valleys and call that our height, right? And based off the aspect ratio of the distance between the peaks and the height between the peaks and the valleys, we'll get different aspect ratios. Here, when we look again a little bit over to the right, we see a very narrow width, but seemingly a pretty large height. So this is where the width and the height starts to come from, and it's really that the way that these waves work, where we talk about aspect ratios. And if there's a perfect aspect ratio, right, 4:3, 2:1, something along those lines, as opposed to saying, hey, that's the perfect aspect ratio, we kind of refer to that as a perfect interval. It's just the way that they refer to them, right? And this is where perfects come from. So diving into this a little bit more, let's take the open A string on your guitar. Well, the A string vibrates at 110 hertz. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, it's not important, because it's not going to affect your music. Just realize that when you pluck the open A string on a guitar, the number of times that it vibrates up and down is 110 times per second. Okay? Now, if you take your index finger, your ring finger, your middle finger, whichever one, and you put it on the octave of the A string, and you do that exact same pluck, well, at that point, it's going to vibrate 220 times per second, or 220 hertz. So as we move up the fretboard, the reason that the pitch gets higher is because we increase the frequency that the string vibrates at, okay? But here, you can see that at 110 of the open string, or 220 at the octave, right? So we're looking at this 110 to 220, and if we look at that, that's a 2:1, right? And we'll look at the octave here in a second, but that means at the octave it rings out exactly twice as much as the open A. And if you recall, we call the octave the perfect eighth. The reason that we call it the perfect eighth is because it has this perfect ratio, and so we have a perfect interval, in this case, the perfect eighth. So with that being said, we have the perfect unison as well, and that's just one for one. Basically, it means the same note that you're hitting, if you hit it again, it's going to ring out identically, right? So it's a perfect unison. Most people just call it a unison, but technically it's a perfect unison because it has this perfect interval, right? 1:1, not 1.2:1. That'd be weird, considering it's the same note. So 1:1. Then we have the perfect fourth, and we have 4:3. Meaning, if we're on the 5th fret of the A string and we're holding it down and we hit it, it's gonna vibrate, let's say, 4 times a minute. And when we release the string and we hit the A string, it's going to vibrate 3 times a minute. So the perfect fourth, for every 4 vibrations that the perfect fourth has, so when your finger's on the 5th fret, for every 4 vibrations, when you release that and just hit the open string, it's going to only vibrate 3 times to that, right? So hold it down, you get 4 times, then you release it, you get 3 times, right? And so it's a 4:3. It's a perfect ratio, or a perfect interval, i.e. perfect fourth. Perfect fifth, exact same thing. Only difference now is for every 3 times that the string vibrates when you're holding it down on the 7th fret. For every 3 times, if you release it, the open string will only vibrate twice, for every 3 times on the perfect 5th. But again, as we're looking at this, we see these, even numbers. There's no decimal point, right? There's no 1.1, there's no 1.6, there's no 4.8 to 3.4 or anything else. It's perfect theoretically, as far as the numbers work out. And again, if we talk about the octave, which is perfect 8th, we have exactly 2 to 1, right? We spoke about that. So this is why we call these intervals, right? The perfect 5th, the perfect 4th, perfect 8th octave, perfect unison, same note, right? Whatever. But the reason that we call them perfects, and we don't really talk about perfects as a measurement of distance like we do with the augmented, the diminished, the major, and the minor, is because of this aspect ratio. Now, it does not matter if you know that the E string vibrates at 110 hertz. That doesn't matter. It's just I wanted to bring up those numbers so you could kind of understand a little bit about what we were talking about here. But these perfect intervals give us one area that is very interesting to our music. And when we look at the fretboard, our perfect 4th is on the 5th fret, our perfect 5th is on the 7th fret, and our perfect 8th, i.e. our octave, is at the 12th fret. And if you're looking at your fretboard, guitarist or bassist, irrelevant, everybody gets this. You will get good harmonics when you go to the 5th fret, the 7th fret, or the 12th fret. And the reason you get good harmonics is because of the perfect 4th, the perfect 5th, and the perfect 8th. Because you have that perfect interval or perfect aspect ratio is why you get very good harmonics with this. One thing I do want to point out, it doesn't have to be on the open strings, right? I mean, definitely if you're on the open strings in 5th, 7th, and 12th, you got it. But let's say you're on the G string and you're on the 4th fret, you play a B and you want to get a harmonic off of that. And maybe you want to get the perfect 4th harmonic off of that. So if you take your picking hand and you tap on the 9th fret very lightly, it's really the bar over the 9th fret. If you tap on that pretty lightly and pretty quickly, that's still a perfect 4th up from the B on the G string, right? So your G string, the B, is going to be on the 4th fret, and the perfect 4th up from that B is going to be on your 9th fret, which is going to be your E, right? And so if you are on the G string and you're playing that B, which is on the 4th fret, and you want to get a good harmonic, if on the G string you take your tapping hand or your picking hand and you tap on the 9th fret, which is the E, which is a perfect 4th up from B, you'll get a nice harmonic. Not because it's the 9th fret, but because it's the perfect 4th from where you're playing. So you get that 5 frets up. So perfect unison, whatever, kind of, you would kind of have to tap an octave up, I guess, on that, and that's fine. You'll still get good octaves or good harmonics on the octave up. But the perfect 4th, the perfect 5th, the perfect 8th, i.e. the octave, gives us very good harmonics. And this is why, and so that is the one area where the perfect interval is different than the diminished or the augmented or the major or the minor, which moves up and down a fret. The perfect is numerically, mathematically, an even aspect ratio. So anyways, with that being said, that pretty much rounds us out for the discussions on intervals. And now we can move into the other modes of the major scale, and we can talk very easily about why some of them are major modes or minor modes or diminished modes. And we can have very good, easy conversations now that we have this foundation with intervals. So with that being said, again, let me know down in the comments anything that might be tripping you up with this or anything you got out of it. I'd love to hear from you. And, please, if you're getting something out of these videos and it's helping you understand your guitar better or your bass better, please give me a thumbs up. hit that subscribe, and that really, you know, it helps out the channel, allows me to keep on bringing you some really good content. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and close out the video, and we will see you in the next ones, which we will start talking about more of our major modes. Take care, everybody.